So let's say an incident happens. What should an organization do? How do you go about minimizing the damage, and what should a response plan look like?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I will say up front, the very first thing is that you want to accomplish a lot of these steps and you want to do preparation before an attack happens. Because if you haven't done anything and you've been hit by ransomware, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to do it in an efficient and cost effective way. You may not be able to recover your data. Basic business continuity planning will go a long way in helping you recover from a ransomware attack. And it doesn't even need to be ransomware specific. We want to identify what systems in the organization are critical systems, what is our critical data, and make sure that we have a plan for some resiliency or to put some resiliency behind those pieces of information and those systems. I ask companies very often when we're working together, do you have a priority restoration list? And if you're going to recover an entire information system, which servers are going to come up first? So really those two things are the biggest things that you can do prior to getting hit with an attack. So it's going to be business continuity planning, just understanding that general level of resiliency and what your critical systems are, and having done some planning for actually handling an incident like this.
Now, ransomware attacks are not black and white. There are lots of different shades of gray. So with that in mind, are there any circumstances in which leaders should just keep quiet and pay the ransom?
This is always a question when you're considering your ransomware strategy. And so one of the things that I would like to point out for those who think, well, worst case scenario, we'll just pay the ransom. Paying the ransom actually may not be an option. It depends on the country of origin. It depends on whether there are sanctions on ransomware attack groups. US persons are generally prohibited from engaging in transactions with individuals or entities that are on that blocked persons list. We look at cultural considerations within the organization. What is your reputational risk if you were to go and pay the ransom? And so there may be circumstances, and we've seen several of them over the last several years, where companies pay the ransom simply because they can't function without their data, and again, when you pay the ransom, when you make that decision, there's no guarantee that you're going to get an encryption key. There's no guarantee that the key is going to actually work to recover your data. Again, that's one that's really great to have a discussion prior to having to deal with ransomware. Maybe when you're doing your annual strategy session, or if you're doing an incident response exercise, have that conversation with your executive team as far as understanding what's the tolerance and what's the appetite for actually paying a ransom if we found ourselves in that situation.
So how does communication come into play during a ransomware incident response? There's probably a lot of internal and external messaging that has to be considered and delivered quite quickly. And if you're offline, how do you do that?
Yeah. There is. And this is one of those things that we tell our clients when you're planning for a ransomware incident or for a ransomware response. You can't assume that your normal communications channels are going to be available. You can't assume that you're going to be able to email all of your employees and tell them what's going on. You can't assume that you're going to be able to send an email to any regulatory body that you might need to communicate with, because your systems may be compromised. They might be unavailable. And that really goes for any type of incident response planning, not just ransomware. So communications, it really is a key part of how successful you're going to be in managing the event overall. Good communication at the outset that's comprehensive and consistent and clear can go a long way towards limiting the damage in terms of reputational risk. There should be a unified message talking to external partners, whether it's media or customers, and then internally communications. You've got to decide what you're going to tell your employees, what the impact is. And again, if at all possible, we want to see some sort of communications plan developed prior to when you actually need it. And we have this in a lot of organizations for things like active shooter. We saw this during the pandemic when we developed communications plans for how we were going to communicate to employees about health measures and protective measures and things like that. And ransomware is really no different.